Today we are doing the mid-year book tag. Just like a little check-in about all the books that I have read this year so far, whether they are standouts or disappointments. And have there been disappointments? Hello, if you don't know me, my name is Kat. We talk books here. I'm a Gemini and mood reader, so I read a little bit of everything, but in particular I try to read diversely. So if that's something that you're interested in, check out my other channels and my content on this channel. There's a lot of diverse book recs. Let's get started. In 2024 so far, I have read 36 books. Let's do a little presentation because that's always fun. This is my story graph. If you don't know what story graph is, it's like an indie alternative to Goodreads. It is Black owned. One of the great things about story graph is that they take the data from all of your reading activity that you log and they create graphics and like charts out of your data, which is really fun. If you're a reader, chances are you love information, so this is one of the best parts about story graph for me. So let's get into my year so far. As you can see, my reading goal for 2024 is 69 books. Why did I pick 69? Because last year I think I did 75 and it was way too many, but I wanted a number that was greater than 52, which is like one book per week, because I usually read more than that. I wanted it to be properly challenging without it being outrageous, and 69 was just, you know, it's right between those two numbers, so there's no other reason why I picked this number. So here are the charts and graphs, which I think are so fun. It tells you like what are the moods of the different books. So for me, the biggest one was emotional. Other ones are funny, lighthearted, reflective. It's kind of funny because I think last year my most read moods were like dark, and I think I'm in a much better mental state this year. And then it also separates by genre, so as you can see, I really love romance and historical romance, literary and contemporary. This is also helpful. It tells you how many queer books you've read. My most read authors, Viet Thanh Nguyen, because I read The Sympathizer and the sequels, that's 2. Heather Fawcett, again I read 2 of the Emily Wilde books. And Julia Quinn, because I have read 2 of the Bridgerton books this year. Also gives you this really fun chart that like tells you when you're reading the most number of pages and books. Sometimes these peaks for me correlate with like very bad mental states when I'm just reading, and sometimes I'm just really happy and reading a lot, so I don't know how much this tells you. And lastly, it tells me that my average rating is a 3.92, which is actually quite high, so I think I've been reading really good books this year. Hopefully that was fun. I want to give like a better overview of the kinds of books that I have been reading so far this year, more than the answers to my questions in the tag, because I feel like the questions in the tag are more like, oh, these are the highlights, these are the lowlights, versus like what is the overall picture of what you've been reading this year. But with that being said, let's get into the actual questions. The first question is, what is the best book of 2024 that you've read so far? For me, it is Sula by Toni Morrison. I've talked about Sula before in one of my reading vlogs earlier this year. I think it's one of those books that you pick up and within the first couple of sentences you can tell this is why it's a classic. This is why Toni Morrison is so revered as a writer. I went into Sula not knowing much besides that it is kind of like the book about complicated female friendships, and it definitely is. If you don't know the premise of Sula, it's about 2 young black girls growing up in the same town and they become friends, and it's about their girlhood and their childhood together, and also about them growing up and how their relationship becomes very complicated through like romantic relationships and societal expectations and their unique paths and how they each navigate the demands of femininity and patriarchy. Just how the different paths that they choose to navigate the world that they lived in affected how they could relate to each other, or how they could see each other, or maybe how they couldn't see each other. It made me think a lot about how female friendships are often so complicated because of all of the factors in society and in life that pit us against each other. Obviously, women are made to compete against each other for male attention and validation, and that definitely plays a big part in Sula, but it also is larger than that. It really digs into the question of how far do you have to go to live outside the bounds of societal expectations, and what it takes to live a truly free life, and if it's possible to live this truly free life when the other people around you are bound by those expectations. When the Lorde remix of Girl So Confusing by Charli XCX dropped, the first thing I was thinking about was Sula, because the way that that song encapsulates so much of like misunderstandings and miscommunication in female friendships, and just how difficult it can be to nurture female friendships because of all of the things that pit us against each other. The second question is the best sequel of 2024 that you've read so far, and mine is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands, which is the sequel to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. I loved Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. I read that I think in the beginning of this year and it was such a joy. I think it is classified within romantasy, but you could also classify it in like cozy academia or like cozy fantasy. The story is about a fairy researcher named Emily Wilde. She moves to this remote village to study the fairies there, but then her academic rival Wendell comes barging in and basically takes over her investigation. And of course the academic rival is also her love interest. So it is rivals to lovers, which I love. But she also suspects that Wendell may not be quite human and he may in fact be fae. I really like how the fae are depicted in this series. One of my gripes about fae romance, in particular the ones that have been very popular as of late, is that the fae are depicted as just like, they're just humans with wings. As with Cindy says, fairies are just like men with wings and big dicks. But that's not the case in this series. I think this series pulls a lot from actual folklore. I love the world building, but I also love that it is cozy and not too, you don't have to use your brain a ton. Sometimes with high fantasy it can be difficult to get started because you're like, what is this entirely new world that I'm having to learn about? But with this series you don't really have that like learning curve to get into it, yet the world building is lush and wonderful. I love the romance as well. It is not spicy, but even better than spice, slow burn and emotional intimacy. Like I said, I love the first one, and if you really love a book, the sequel can be a disappointment, but for me the sequel was almost even better than the first. I think it was even better actually, because as a follow-up, it just built upon the world even more, it built upon the relationship more. Sometimes in series, when there is a romantic relationship and the characters get together, there isn't that spark anymore between them, but with this series, there is still the will they, won't they tension that I love. And I found the plot a lot more interesting as well. There was more action, which was really fun to read. The next question is, what is a new release in 2024 that you haven't read yet, but that you want to? For me, it is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. This came out pretty recently. I've heard really great things about it and about Tommy Orange in general. My friend got a signed copy for me, which is really sweet. Thank you, Jasmine. So I definitely have to read it. This book tells the story of the ancestors in their first novel, They're There, which I also have but have not read yet. But I've had this one for years, so this is totally on me. Like, I really need to read this one. I think I might have to read this one first and then read this one. Even though this is about the ancestors of the characters in this one, I think it would make sense to read them in the order that they were written. But if you don't know, Tommy Orange is a Native American writer. There tells a story of 12 different characters who are traveling to the big Oakland powwow. So I think it's kind of like a community portrait type of novel. And then Wandering Stars takes place in 1864. It looks like it's about forced assimilation. So this is about a survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre who is brought to the Fort Marion prison castle, where he is forced to learn English and practice Christianity. And then it follows his son, who is sent to the school founded by the guy who forced him to practice Christianity. It's one of those schools that was like a forced assimilation type of institution where it was all about eradicating Native American culture. Obviously it sounds heartbreaking, but also it's such an important part of history that our country has done a very good job of erasing, of sanitizing, and of trying to minimize so that we don't perceive it as the really fucked up thing that it was. So I'm glad that we have authors like Tommy Orange who are writing about this history. The next question is my most anticipated release for the second half of 2024, and that is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. This is just a chance for me to show off the fact that I got an ARC. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. The galleys are numbered and personalized, so this one has my name in it. I had to beg FSG for this, but I have no regrets. I've already started it, and so far it is really different from Sally Rooney's other work in terms of the writing style. I think she's transcended the institution of a full sentence in intermezzo, but I would say that the themes and the characters that she's writing about are really similar to what she's written about before, and I think it's pretty clear that she is building off of those themes. However, in intermezzo, the main characters that we are primarily in the heads of are male main characters, so that is different from her other novels. The story is about two brothers who have recently lost their father. The older one is a lawyer who is outwardly very successful but inwardly a mess, as many of her characters tend to be, and the younger brother is a chess prodigy. So the novel follows them as they are grieving this loss and also in their relationships with women. I think it's going to be like the other side of her other novels, where you're primarily from the female perspective in these unstable relationships with men, and in intermezzo I think we're going to get the male perspective, because I think these relationships are going to have a lot in common with the relationships that she's written about before. I am planning to do a reading vlog and a review of this book ASAP, so stay tuned for that. The next question is the biggest disappointment of 2024. And if you've watched my other videos, you can probably guess which one this one is. It is To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods. I don't even know what to say about this book because I did make like a 40-minute rant about it, so I guess you could just watch that. But the reason why it was so disappointing is because I was really hoping for the allegations of it being a colonizer romance to be untrue. I love Asian-inspired fantasy. I think it's such a fun way if you're like of the Asian diaspora to reconnect with your heritage. But when this book came out, there was a lot of buzz about the fact that there is a relationship between someone who is the colonizer and someone who is the colonized. There was quite a bit of drama about it because the author responded. So I went into it hoping that like maybe it was a media literacy issue. In addition to that, I found the writing itself to not be particularly inspiring. But that's all I'm gonna say on this book in this video. If you want to know more, you can watch my 40-minute rant. The biggest surprise of 2024 for me was Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood. If you had told 2023 me that I would end up loving an Ali Hazelwood romance in 2024, you know, I don't think I would have believed you. Up until Bride, which is I think the turning point for me in terms of enjoying Ali Hazelwood's books, I was not a big fan of her romance. I think her first couple of romances just had some elements in it that I didn't particularly love, such as the really obvious in-your-face size kink. But when I read Bride, I absolutely loved it. I thought that Ali's voice and her writing style is perfect for this kind of light-hearted science fiction romance. So I was very much looking forward to her sequel to Bride, which I actually thought Not in Love was a sequel to Bride because she had written like Not in Love on her Instagram bio, and I thought it was like, I thought there would be knots. I thought there would be knots, but there were not knots. And indeed, Not in Love was a normie romance, but I kept reading it because I actually found myself really enjoying it. First of all, I found that Rue, the main character, was pretty different from her other main characters. She wasn't like overly quirky or clueless. She was a little clueless, but she wasn't that clueless. And she was very sexually experienced, which was different from a lot of her other characters. It was also, I think, her spiciest novel, and again, I'm not the biggest fan of the intimacy in her novels. However, I did like the way that she treated the intimacy. It's interesting because I didn't really enjoy the scenes themselves. However, I liked what they did for the novel and the plot and the relationship development, if that makes sense. I liked how she used kink and intimacy as a way to show that there was trust building between the characters. I think a lot of romance authors attempt to do this, but I think sometimes it can feel rather forced. However, because of the characters and who they are in Not in Love, it felt really organic for this particular relationship and this book. I will admit that the ending made me cry. What can I say? I love love. The other surprise for me in 2024 is The Other Olympians. This is a non-fiction book, and the reason why this was a surprise for me is not because I didn't think it would be good. I was surprised that I read it in like a week, and that's really fast for me for non-fiction. Usually I have to do an audiobook or I just won't finish the book. I just ate this up like it was a beach read. I really enjoyed it. The Other Olympians is about the origins of sex testing in sports and the Olympics, and how all this really arose from Nazi Germany and eugenics. What I really took away from this book was that sex testing isn't really a way to ensure that there is fairness in sports, because the origins of it are so murky and so wrapped up in Nazi politics, and it exists to reinforce this binary that doesn't always make sense because sex is not binary. It also revealed a lot about the policing and surveillance of womanhood throughout history, and in particular how that is tied to the way that women of color and working class women are viewed as more masculine or not as womanly as white women or upper class women. Another thing that I found really interesting was the treatment of trans athletes in the past. We think of history as progressing in a linear fashion, and so with all the transphobia in our modern day, you would think that in the past it was even worse. And it was worse in some ways, but in some ways it wasn't. And so it talks about how, you know, when the first trans athletes came out, people were actually quite curious and receptive to the news. So that was really interesting to me. And it was just so fascinating to delve into this forgotten piece of history. I really recommend this, especially with the Olympics coming up. I think it's so important to read. The next question is my fave new to me author of 2024. So this is an author that I have read for the first time this year. And I have to say that it is Toni Morrison. I'm like kicking myself for not reading any of her books sooner, but if you have a recommendation for which one I should read next, definitely let me know. Next is my newest fictional crush of 2024. I actually feel like I haven't become obsessed with a fictional character in a really long time, but I would have to say that so far this year, maybe Javier Castillo from Anna Huang's King of Sloth. Usually the billionaire romance trope is not my favorite, but I am enjoying her, I think it's Kings of Sin series. My favorites are King of Sloth and King of Pride, I think, because that's the Asian guy. I don't know why every like dark romance author names their Asian men Kai. Like, is that even a common name? Anyway, I had a lot of fun with King of Sloth. I read it on a flight. I should have known this going into an Anna Huang book, but sometimes her books are like, you know, not, I guess they're all pretty spicy. But I was reading this on my Kindle and I got to a certain scene and the flight attendant walked past me. My heart like stopped. But anyway, it was a really fun read for a flight. Like, I just sped through it. I really liked the main characters in King of Sloth because I always love when the female main character is an ice queen, when she's obsessed with work. So yeah, I love a girl boss main character because our girl bosses deserve love too. I think it's my Capricorn moon, like that part of me just feels so seen. I also love the male main character, even though usually like the lazy playboy type is like not my thing at all. Like usually I find that like really fucking annoying, but in this case he just has a lot of trauma and he was really sweet. He just treated his girl really well. Like, he was just really nice and kind. I think Anna Huang does do a little too much in trying to be like, oh, billionaires have problems too, because there was a subplot where there's this gossip columnist who I think is modeled after like Perez Hilton or something, who is constantly like trying to take down these billionaires, and they have like this subplot to take him down. But I'm like, dude, like, you guys are billionaires. This is just a man trying to make like kind of a dishonest living, but he's just trying to make it out there. But anyway, Javier sounded really hot. Second fictional crush would have to be Wendell from the Emily Wilde series. My best friend also read this series and she said that Wendell reminds her of Hal from Howl's Moving Castle, and I totally see it. He has like kind of like really charming cavalier attitude, but also kind of like would murder for you. So, you know, best of both worlds. The next question is my newest favorite character of 2024. This was kind of hard because I felt like there wasn't really any particular character that I really fell in love with, as I said, but I really did appreciate Emily's character in Emily Wilde. She is written as a neuroatypical character and I really love that representation. I also love reading a main character who is actually morally gray. Like Emily Wilde, despite it being such a cozy series, the main character is actually quite morally gray. She does some things that even Wendell is like, but I love reading a character like that you can still root for and you still understand their perspective and you're still ultimately hoping that they get their happy ending. I think it is difficult to write, but so rewarding as a reader to experience. Speaking of morally gray characters, Sula is another great one. She does things in the novel that you're just like, Like, I want to defend you, but I can't. But you also see like what Toni Morrison is doing with her character and what she's showing with her character. It is really enjoyable to read these characters because they are so complex and nuanced. Next is books that made me cry. Obviously, I said that Not in Love kind of made me tear up at the end, but I didn't like full on sob. Crying in H Mart is another one that made me cry a little bit. It's a memoir about the author's mother getting cancer and then losing her. It is sad, and it did make me cry because it made me think about all those complicated feelings that come with grief. But the one that made me sob and continuously sob throughout the book is Against the Loveless World. It takes the form of a framed narrative where the main character is in an Israeli prison and she is telling the story of her life and how she got there. The author does an incredible job of putting you into the perspective of someone who has suffered at the hands of Israeli oppression as a Palestinian, and to have that in their lineage, like to have that generationally be something that has affected them. Another thing that I really loved about this novel is that it really focuses on the relationships between people and how all of the characters' actions are really driven by love for each other and their community and their culture. There is also a love story in the novel that is really beautiful, and I think it really illustrates how love can be a form of resistance. When there is an entity that is determined to steal all of your love, all of your joy, and everything that is beautiful about your world. I would recommend this book to anyone. I think everyone should read it. It is definitely the most impactful book I think I've read this year. The next one is a book that made you happy. For me, I would have to say like maybe King of Sloth, because it was just such a fun read on the plane. But I also want to shout out This Is Why They Hate Us. This is a YA book about a bisexual Mexican-American teenager who is really just discovering himself and his sexuality and figuring out who he is during one wild summer. He's in love with his best friend, but he feels that isn't requited, so he goes on this kind of self-discovery journey where he hooks up with a bunch of other guys and like has all these experiences. I think it's a great summer read. The writing is really funny and fresh. The best friend is Palestinian American and it is treated with a lot of care and respect. And I just love queer YA books. I think there can never be enough of them because I feel like when I was growing up there was like not very much at all, especially queer books with BIPOC representation. So I think this made my inner child really happy. The next question is the most beautiful book, and unfortunately for me, one of the most beautiful books of 2024 is To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods. Like, look at this cover, it is stunning. It also came with this artwork that is so pretty. This is the colonizer romance, so I can't even like appreciate how pretty this is. But the inside cover is stunning. It is just a beautiful book. Another book I have that is really stunning is Faybound. Like, the cover is just so pretty. I think there's also different colors of this cover which are also equally gorgeous. Unfortunately, I did not love this. I thought it was okay. It wasn't all that I hoped for, I guess. Faybound is a romantasy. It is set in this world that is inspired by Arab and African culture. And of course, the characters are really diverse. One of the things that I really loved about Faybound was how natural and organic the inclusion of different marginalized identities into this world was. However, the writing and the story itself, I think the main problem was that the characters were a lot dumber than the reader, because the reader can see like this is heavy foreshadowing, this is gonna happen, but then the characters don't know until like there's like this much left of the book. So then you're left thinking like, why are these characters so dumb? I was entertained by the story, and I think it might be a trilogy or something. I think the world building was actually quite interesting. I might give the second book a shot just because the actual story and the world is interesting. Next is books I need to read by the end of the year. And honestly, I don't really do like a list of books that I'm going to read. I kind of just feel it out and pick up what I want to. But the one book that I am obviously going to read is Intermezzo. I groveled so hard for that book. Of course I'm gonna read it. The last question is your favorite book to movie adaptation. I'm gonna do you one better and do my favorite book to miniseries adaptation. I think that miniseries tend to do better in adapting books because there's just more screen time and more space to tell the story. For me, it is A24's The Sympathizer. This adaptation oh my god. I feel like it is the god tier of adaptations. I actually started watching the series before I read the book, and I was already so bought into the adaptation. I really loved the actors, I loved how it was shot, I loved the way they were telling the story in this really fun and interesting non-linear way. Also, it's directed by Park Chan-wook, which is like the perfect director for any kind of spy kind of film or thriller. And the adaptation has Sandra Oh and Robert Downey Jr. and just an incredible cast, incredible production behind it. So when I started reading the book, I kind of was like, I didn't even know what to expect because it was hard to imagine this adaptation as a book because of the way they formatted it so well for the screen. And to my surprise, as I began reading the book, I could tell right away that the adaptation had perfectly preserved the tone of the book and the spirit of it. And by that, I mean the voice of the protagonist is really well captured in the TV adaptation, and not just because they preserved a lot of the writing, but also through, you know, how you're shown his point of view in the acting, in the actor's facial expressions, even in the way that the adaptation is shot. It begins in a very slick, kind of snappy spy thriller format, and then as it progresses, when there are instances of more emotional intensity, you see really shaky camera movements. It's just done really, really well. And I think all the changes they made from book to screen really worked for the adaptation. Even the changes that changed the story quite a bit still made a lot of sense, and I actually preferred them in the adaptation. I really do recommend reading The Sympathizer if you haven't, and I also recommend the show. I enjoyed how I watched the show first and then read the book because it helps you understand what's going on, honestly. And you also get to imagine Hwa Chon-dae as the main character. And the main character in the book is kind of gross. He's not supposed to be likable, and it's on purpose. But Hwa Chon-dae is such a cutie. So it makes the book more enjoyable, I think, getting to imagine him as the main character. I don't know why more people are not talking about the adaptation, because it is, I think, genuinely the best thing on TV right now. Granted, I don't watch a ton of TV, but I do think it is the best thing on TV right now. If you've read any of these books, let me know. I would love to know your thoughts. And if you want to answer these questions as well, feel free to do so in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.